This is going to be a very serious conversation for the next 40 minutes. And I would ask all of you that want to participate in this conversation to start thinking now about what you know or what you don't know about human trafficking in the 21st century. As a journalist who's covered this for 16 years worldwide, I've heard some naivete during the last course of the 2 days that I've been here in terms of where the world is and the ramifications from the instability. I also want to challenge all of you to participate in fighting human trafficking and fighting the instabilities all over the world. There is not one country that does not have human trafficking. It happens on the street and it happens on the internet. This title of our panel is The Business Implications of Human Trafficking and the Syrian Refugee Crisis. We're also going to talk about human trafficking and what it really is. This is a shared global shame. We are all involved in it by our acts of omission or acts of commission, and it is a mission unaccomplished because the message that we have worldwide is that we've conquered it, when in fact it has just changed as history has changed. The biggest challenges that we have is ignorance and indifference. Ignorance can be solved through education, evidence, and honesty. What I call a reality check of the facts. The indifference really comes from who leads the conversation, and you must have bold vision and an inspirational leadership to conquer this. We are seeing in the world today, in the last 16 years, that human trafficking is increasing. That should be very alarming to people because we think that we have solved it. There are conversations out there among a lot of people that are in the human trafficking arena. The who, what, and where. Many times you'll hear a lot of the NGOs, the non-government organizations, speak about women and girls. Boys and men are raped and sold. So do not think that there's a line of demarcation by gender. When we talk about what it is, it's transnational and it's transcriminal. What does that mean, transnational? That means it's within countries, it's across countries, it's across regions. Transcriminal means that most of the people that are involved with human trafficking actually are involved with drugs and weapons and black markets and illegal tobacco. They commodify the human being and they sell them as a product. Where does it happen? It happens on the street and it happens on the internet in today's world. We live in a technological world, and as a result of this, to make it simple so that you understand what we want to talk about today and get you involved with fighting and joining, is the 8 different phases of human trafficking. We have labor, and there's so much within labor for the diversification that there is one entity that has its own name. It's called child soldiers. We have sex trafficking. We have sex tourism. A lot of people talk about the victims being moved. We know that pedophiles may go to Cambodia, Thailand, Costa Rica to buy a child. And because of the world that we live in today, if you have a computer and if you have a digital camera, if you rape a child, you can take a picture and that act ends up on the internet, and it's called internet pedocriminality. We have organ trafficking. Think of the value of your kidney. Depending upon what country you're in, your kidney may be more valuable financially to you if you decided to sell it. And there are children who are kidnapped on the street and who don't have a say if somebody takes their kidney out of their body. Skin trafficking is an oddity for a lot of people, but think of it as voodoo. Think of it as part of the human body. And if you want to talk about the like-minded people in a community, think of ritual abuse torture. The best example that I can give you as a journalist is ISIS. ISIS has all 8 faces of this human trafficking model. Since we live in the digital age, we have to take into consideration the internet and the technology, the globalization of trade, and mass migrations. When we think about things that are happening in this region of the world, we can get down to who's responsible for it, when it started, but at the same time, you have to understand the ramifications of war and conflicts has migratory ramifications to it. This is not the first time we have seen it, but it is on steroids compared to when the Balkan crisis happened in the early 1990s. So what we're going to try to do today is hopefully educate the business leaders that are in this room. And we can tell you that you ought to get involved with the fight for moral reasons. And if that's not an incentive, then maybe you think about the liability to your country, because in the last 16 years, liability to your company, because in the last 16 years, there have been a lot of laws that have been passed, and hence, if you find out that you are involved with human trafficking unknowingly, you may be liable. If you get US government money, President Obama signed an executive order in 2012 that says that if, in order to get that money, you have to promise that you're not going to be involved in human trafficking. And if you are, you've got a problem. Now, I will tell you from personal experience that I have actually been hired to investigate a member of YPO, because I was doing some research on sugar plantations and the history of the sugar industry in terms of slavery. And I've discovered that a member of YPO was falsely accused by somebody for corporate espionage. So there is that capability today, because we live in the human rights era, of people taking on your industries or your corporations, even though you are not involved, and that's a risk factor that has to be at the table when you have a conversation with your board, because it may happen to you. It happened to the Vincinis in Dominican Republic, and not only were they not involved with human trafficking, but they spent millions to upgrade the sugar plantations that were in the Dominican Republic. And I investigated it on every level, and I came to the conclusion that the people who falsely accused them, that produced a documentary, that were involved with some competition of sugar plantations in Europe, were out of line. But the problem was this: the documentary that was produced was what we call a POV in my business, which means a point of view. And that point of view means that because the Vincinis were so popular and they were public figures, that they really couldn't do anything about it. So if you Google them, just know that what you're reading on the internet right now is false information. And that can happen to anyone. That was a wake-up call to me about 6 years ago when I was asked to look into this, because their lawyers asked me if I would take a look at it as somebody who understood human trafficking, and I came back and said, not only are they not traffickers, but I could dissect the documentary at the time and prove that the information that was available was the producer did not use. So it was an intentional point of view for defamation. Now, what we focus on is practical solutions. You have about 100 years of experts on this panel today, and people that have seen it in different parts. We need to get you all involved. And I want to challenge you, because I was challenged 16 years ago by a victim in Albania in a safe house who said to me, nobody cares about us. And I said, you tell me your story, I'll take it to the world. And that is why I stand before you today. In addition to that, to clear my head before I released my first investigation, I went to South Africa for a safari by myself. And when I was at Branson's place at Ulasaba, the driver said to me, so Christine, what you're saying is slavery's alive and well in the 21st century. And I said, yes. And then he said to me, well, now that you know it, what are you going to do about it? So that is part of the reason why I have been speaking out about this for 16 years, trying to get groups of people to shift their paradigm on how they view the world. So some of the things we're going to share with you today are going to be a little bit graphic. Some of it's going to be statistical, but understand that you can get involved here. And there's two ways that you can do it. I'm going to introduce you to a man named Jim Gamble and a woman named Helga Conrad. You know Jim Woolsey from in the earlier panels today, and Nancy Iosi, who is a member of YPO. We have all seen, investigated, been on the scene, watched, talked to victims. We've tried to turn the models upside down. We also have seen that in the last 16 years, there's an emphasis for taking care of victims. I went to business school. This doesn't work for me. Because if we just focus on taking care of victims, that means that we might as well go into the Catholic charity business. I think this has to be flipped upside down so we focus on the prevention so there isn't an increase of the population of human trafficking victims all over the planet. We are supposed to be living in the 21st century in terms of an enlightenment on human rights. But if there's an increase of human trafficking in society, we all need to wake up, because this is a conversation. You may take actions at your corporate board level. You may not even know, because of outsourcing of contracts 3 or 4 times down the road, whether or not you contribute to it. But if you find out, like we did, U.S. manufacturing plants in free trade zones in Jordan, or on a U.S. military base in Iraq, there were people that were trafficked from Nepal and India serving soup at the U.S. military base. It didn't mean the generals were traffickers. It didn't mean the CEOs in the U.S. manufacturing plants in Jordan were traffickers. It meant that they were unconscious. So today we're going to try to get you people to understand that this is not about politics. This is about rewiring how you think and painting on the canvas some reality so that you understand that this is a shared global shame. In the travel and the tourism business, they have what is called the code. That is set up. It is a code, it's almost like a manifesto, and it's a promise within the travel agency that they will not allow their resources to be used for any type of trafficking. The Virtual Global Task Force, and the wind behind setting up the Virtual Global Task Force is Jim Gamble, who I consider a very dear friend and colleague in this arena. This was done, and I hope you appreciate this when I say this, without an act of Congress and without an act of Parliament. Jim created the first international law enforcement task force for the protection of children online on the internet around 2003. Today, the chairmanship of that is here in the UAE, and I want to acknowledge the government and the chairmanship here because we are in their host country. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin with the discussion. Jim Gamble, why don't you share with this audience, since they are business leaders, how you decided to create something like Virtual Global Task Force?
Well, first of all, good morning. I have to say, from my point of view, what I had to overcome to set it up was actually my own ego. At the time, I became involved in child protection. I was a senior official in law enforcement. I had been the head of counterterrorism in Northern Ireland and was then the Deputy Director General of the NCS dealing with serious and organised crime globally. I was asked by our Home Secretary whether or not I would set up an organisation to protect children on the basis of what we were learning about them being trafficked and what we were learning about the threat that was posed to them on the internet as it emerged. And I have to say that my friends in law enforcement, my friends, and I still had some then in politics, I have none left now, they said to me, this is like 3 steps backwards. You know, you're poised for something. And, you know, to be honest, my ego, and there are 2 types of people, I believe, those that have an ego and recognize it and those who lie. But my ego was so large that I actually did think, you know, this is a step backwards, this dealing with children stuff. I went to Cambodia, to cut a long story short, to speak at an event while still thinking about whether I'd do this or not, and was taken to Steng Menchi, the municipal dump, by members of an American NGO. And I can be critical of NGOs because I think there are so many, sometimes it becomes congested and confused. But there are very many NGOs who do good work. And they took me to the field in Steng Menchi when I met a child, Shrey Noi. This municipal dump is where kids would go out about this big, they would pick up rubbish all day, and they'd get 25 cents if they filled a bag that was bigger than them. You see real dignity then when you see young women working there who'd rather work there for the 25 cents than be sold for between $7 and $12 back then in 2003, 2004. People would sell their children from the dump. They'd be taken away by men to their hotel, they'd be used, abused, and then dumped back in the street. And as I stood in the dump in Steng Menchi, which for me very much was my road to Damascus with regards to child protection, you feel ashamed, you feel humbled, You wonder why you argue about particular things in your own life, in your own career. And we rescued this little girl. Well, we rescued her. You know, I associate myself with that, and it's shameful to do so. The charity picked her up from the field. They took her back where they had their hospital to rehabilitate her. But she had an illness from which she couldn't be rehabilitated, from which she couldn't be cured. And she died from a blood disease. Child this big called Shrey Noy. And as I got on the plane on my way back to the UK, reflecting on what had happened, I thought there are very few times in your life when you get the opportunity to do something that actually makes a difference. I'd been involved in the moral ambiguity of the war on terror in Ireland. I'd been a senior officer with regards to the war on drugs, which we continually fight because we never win. But here was something that was unambiguous. Here was something where you actually had a goal that was clear. And for me, you know, I committed then to stop moaning about my lot and about what would be next for me, and to do what I could and to use the networks that I had to see how we could combine our resources to best effect to protect children in these vulnerable spaces and places. And I've been very lucky to engage with a lot of people who make a difference. The key people that I engaged with were business, because business knows how to do more with less. I learned more from business than I learned from all of the law enforcement activity I was ever involved in. Because you people take risks with your livelihood, you understand making courageous decisions. So today's an opportunity, and I would ask you, ask the difficult questions, because you've got people on this panel, I think, who can give you answers. And if at the end of the day you go away thinking, you know, what can I do? It's not just about money. It's about cascading what to look for and what to do when you think you've seen it. Using your workforce, making sure you employ the right workforce. Because I'll finish on this. Much of my work has been in the internet. People are seduced by technology, seduced by it. This room is like the internet. When it was empty, it's neutral. When it's filled with people, it's defined in character. And people in this room will be good, bad, or indifferent. And in a room of this number, and let me say this to you with all due respect, because I've said this at the Pope's residence in Santa Marta, and as a Protestant ex-head of Special Branch from Belfast, being invited to the Pope's residence, I think, was a big gig. Let me say this, and I said it there. In fact, my wife sat at the back of the room when I said it, shaking her head so hard I thought it was going to roll off, because she knows I always say this. In a room of this number, there'll be great people, there'll be good people. There'll be people who abuse their partners. And there's likely to be one or two people with a deviant sexual interest in children. If you don't believe that, you're living in a different planet and a different world. Doesn't matter the robe of office, the position of power, or the position of authority, political or otherwise, you hold. It's about the risk. It's about the nature of the beast. It's about people.
I want to talk to you about a study. This is a tidbit of information. When people talk about looking at child abuse images, know that these are images of criminal acts. There's no such thing as child porn. There's no such thing as sex with a child. And when I did one of my first interviews in June of 2000, I interviewed a detective in London, and I asked him, how young are the victims? And he said to me, infants. And it went in one ear, out the other, because this wasn't my world. I didn't know anything. So if you're sitting there thinking, this can't be explosive, let me tell you that I have been in your chairs. I've been in your shoes, because I was skeptical. And I was put through the ringer by law enforcement and by specialists, because I kept on saying, as a seasoned, well-traveled, well-educated journalist, it is impossible for me to believe that there is a black market for infants, babies, and toddlers. And I can guarantee you there is no line of demarcation when it comes to bone evil. This is what it's all about. This is not the good side of enjoyment. This is a reality, and it's a reality check for life. Now, Dr. Helga Conrad was the first special rapporteur for the OSCE, and she has been involved since the 1990s in the human trafficking arena. She has also set up a law enforcement that was 12 countries, was it in Southeast Europe? 12 countries that came together coordinating forward. So I want to ask you, Helga, can you explain to the audience why we have an increase as opposed to a decrease when billions are being spent worldwide. And we've raised the awareness in the last 16 years. We've gotten engagements from other industries and other people, whether it be governments or NGOs. But why is there an increase now?
Yeah, thank you very much for this introduction. Let me say, I mean, when I came to address human trafficking, it was when I was a young politician in my hometown, you know, and the reason was that I realized that human trafficking does harm to people, and on the other hand, it hampers also good governance, and it hampers also good business, and it is a criminal business. In this regard, I would like to echo Christine. It is a business where all the countries, it's the most globalized business in the world, where all the countries are involved, and no country is immune from, even if some countries believe that. It's not true, because all the countries are all involved as countries of origin or countries of destination, and in between we have the countries of transit. You know, but this doesn't mean, transiting doesn't mean it comes in, the problem comes in at one side and goes out the other. No, we have altogether we have a responsibility in addressing this issue. So what I realized was that we need a coordinated approach. So therefore, meanwhile, we have established in most of the countries task forces, national task forces or committees addressing the problem of human trafficking. And meanwhile, we have been aware that human trafficking is nothing stable. You know, it started some 20, 25 years ago. We realized that there is a problem, and it's nothing stable. It has, of course, changed and developed, and traffickers and their accomplices, they adapt to our countermeasures. So therefore, it's important to be attentive, to understand what's going on, and therefore we would like to address you, because for many years we have been focusing on the issue of trafficking for sexual exploitation, and this is a huge problem. But meanwhile, we also realize that there are other problems, you know, like trafficking for labor exploitation. And here is where we would also need you, because also you, in your enterprises, in your companies, you can take your share and contribute to fighting human trafficking on the supply chains, for instance, on other things. You know, we have already developed checklists, recommendations. There are codes of conduct. But what we have to do is we have to implement it. We have to do it. Just on paper is, of course, not enough. And let me just say one more, so that one more information that you know it's really a huge problem. You know, we believe, or there are figures from international organizations that say that human trafficking is a global business which generates $35 billion every year to criminals. And the criminals, these may be, let's say, big criminal organizations, but sometimes it's simply smaller groups, and sometimes even family members are involved. So if we want to be, or if we wish to come to grips with human trafficking, we have to know, to understand what it is, and we have to do something against it altogether. Because the money, you know, is really a dead loss to the development of the countries, and it is built on the utter misery of people. And because the panel before was on terrorism, so human trafficking feeds also other criminal records. We know that, for instance, ISIS, or Daesh, as we call it, take or generate huge money from the criminal business of human trafficking.
And let me just say and put this in context for you, that when we talk about that $35 billion, it's kind of hard to put, you know, because nobody's got a really good accountant to do all this, but that is just for the street. When we talk about the internet, there was a study that was done about I guess it was about 8 years ago, and it was about the same amount of money. So however it is, we know that it's a growth industry. We know it has increased in terms of numbers. We know that through conflicts and wars and chaos and poverty, lack of education, gender bias, you name it, they can't find any jobs, okay? That's why you're an answer to this. That's why, and quite frankly, I kind of like entrepreneurs for one reason only. I've been covering politics my entire life, and I know that you guys outlast most politicians. And you can make a contribution. And coming from a long line of entrepreneurs for 3 generations, I think it's very important for people who can make decisions and can also solve problems, who want to say, yes, let's end something, get involved in this. And there's a certain mindset that is needed, and it's called critical thinking. And people who are focused that say, we're going to go from point A to point B. We're not going to take no. We're not going to slam the doors. You can just get there. And the one reason why I was so thrilled when I started working with Jim is because Jim didn't wait for an act of Congress. He didn't wait for an act of Parliament. He just decided this is what is needed for what he was responsible for as the CEO of the Child Exploitation Online Protection in the UK. And that's the type of critical thinking that we need. And Helge, as a politician in Austria, will get in people's faces and say, no, 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 that adds to the increase. Let's look at what's going to decrease it. Now, Jim Woolsey, let me go to you, because when we talked about terrorism before, explain to this crowd, okay, from your experience with counterterrorism and looking at terrorism and intelligence, and Jim Gamble, you might want to jump in on this one too, the financing, because I think it's important for people to understand, when we talk about terrorism, we're not just talking about guns. We're also talking about the trafficking of antiquities, which is a travesty in this part of the world, as well as the trafficking of human beings. There are auctions going on in the Levant, just like there were in the Balkans, in an area called Arizona back in the 1990s, where they would take women, strip them down, have them turn around, and have somebody place a bet. This isn't like 1800s. This isn't the 1700s. This is in a time when we talk about the universal human rights of 1948. So this is a reality check of what you think you know about human trafficking and the acts of this and the implementation of this, because it is absolute evil. Jim, why don't you add to that?
First of all, I want to compliment Christine for her number of years of attention to this extremely important and difficult issue.
Thank you.
The intelligence agencies around the world in countries that care about this issue, and there are quite a few, normally conduct what they do in the greatest of secrecy. There are some things that you can work with law enforcement on and make substantial progress, and the law enforcement authorities in the United States as well as other countries do that. But in the intelligence world, this is one of those cases in which the really, really important things that are being done, you know they're important because you don't hear a word about them. There has been a good deal of attention by American intelligence over the years because of the humanitarian side of this, as well as the huge financial side, to finding ways to disrupt trafficking and to take action pursuant to presidential finding of covert action being approved. In some very vigorous and, I'd love to tell you, crafty ways. There are enemies. There are people who do their best to foul up that type of undertaking. One, for example, was Edward Snowden, when he released huge numbers of classified documents to the world, including to traffickers. One thing that he disclosed material about was cooperation between the CIA and Mexican intelligence and how it was working. There's only really two explanations for someone like Snowden behaving that way, not filtering through what information he wanted to disclose, the way Daniel Ellsberg disclosed policy papers, Pentagon papers years ago. That's not what Snowden did. What Snowden did was turn loose information that could help the traffickers, the slave masters, and pimps. There's only two real explanations for that. One is that Snowden was and is a slave master and trafficker and pimp. The other possibility is that he really likes helping slave masters and traffickers and pimps. There's no third possibility.
Jimmy, you want to jump in there for a couple?
Yeah, I mean, let me say I disagree with that. Having been...
Me too. Me too.
I've been involved in counterterrorism as a tradesman, a craftsman that's been involved at all of the levels, in places you wouldn't want to be, and I have made mistakes on the ground, and I've done things that I'm not proud of. But let me tell you something, you know, the contribution made to the fight against trafficking by intelligence should not be over-exaggerated, because I think there are priorities. And in the world, when it comes to children, everyone will say that children are a priority. But there are a few people for which it is the priority, and the intelligence agencies aren't those people. There are problems around the world. I'm just conscious of time, and I feel really bad that because you guys are getting such a short piece of time on this. So let me say this. The politics and the political disruption around the world create the circumstances that lead to the vulnerabilities that allow children to be gang associated, that allow children to be driven into sexualization and radicalization. You need a political solution. In the meantime, all of us will be dealing with the symptoms of that. And it's right that we do that. But Edward Snowden's got nothing to do with this. And to use that as an agenda for him, that's about the internet and access to information, which is a good thing. And one of the people on your promo video says, we don't use technology enough. That is right. We don't use technology enough to share information so that we're better informed and make better decisions. Because you guys need to be the first to set foot on the battlefield to combat this, and the last to step off, because you have the workforce, you have the influence, and you don't need the money, you just need the power and the courage to make the right decision and say, I'm not listening to that, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make sure that we don't employ people that we shouldn't. I'm going to make sure that if we see something that we think is wrong, we report it. You have the power to do that, and I don't think we should use this platform to attack Edward Snowden. I've got no position on Snowden, but I'm certainly not going to associate him with human traffickers.
All right, so I'm gonna get the politics out because I want to get back to the issue here, okay? To your responsibility, because a lot of people contribute to charities and they contribute to NGOs and they get involved that way from the business community. You have a responsibility every time you write a check and you donate to make certain that you donate to a group that focuses on decreasing the numbers. And the reason for that is because of your YPO person right here who actually works to take care of the chaos that we collectively create on this planet. And these people who get thrown out of their homes or they have to leave because they're dying and their communities are getting bombed to death. And then they move in migrations. And then they end up in refugee camps in foreign lands. And it's not always a pleasant sight. If you've never been to a refugee camp, take a safari to Africa to clear your head afterwards, but walk in a refugee camp and see what we create on the planet. Now, Nancy Iosas organizes, and you've been involved with this since 1984?
Yeah, 86.
86. So she's been around the block here. okay? She has seen this in different parts of the world. And Nancy, why don't you share quickly, because I think we're running out of time,
Yeah,
and my apologies.
I know, and I'll do my best to make the best of the last 2 minutes.
And you're all invited. They're gonna put us at tables afterwards. So if you have questions and you want to come talk to us, we're available. But
I'll
go
try
ahead,
to
Nancy.
speak fast, but I don't want to do a service to the tremendous amount of suffering that is taking place right now as we speak, going on its 5th year, March 15th, that's happening in Syria. I've been involved in this work for 30 years, and in fact, I have many friends in the room from California, from this region here in Dubai, from around the world. Many of you have been wonderful supporters of our work and of me as a leader. But I must tell you, the last few years have been among the most challenging things I have ever seen. And I have been through the ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, the Rwandan genocide, the horrific things that take place in Darfur, and the atrocities and the war crimes and the slaughter that is happening right now in Syria. Let me just tell you, the story has yet to be told. People are fleeing for their lives. They are unwanted in much of the world. We have turned our eyes aside until last September, when a child washed up on a beach and brought the horrors and the human toll back home. There are 60 million people displaced in the world. So what happens? Let's talk about that for 1 minute.
This is a statistic you can believe, okay? You can't
Since
believe
World
all
War
of them.
II. But let me just say something about that. Think about what it would mean. Think about your own lives for a minute, because the statistics are staggering. Think if you lost your husband, your wife. Think if you had to decide whether or not you were running from an organization that was trying to kill your child in Syria, to whether or not you should throw that child onto a boat with the hope that they would make it across the sea. Think about every coping mechanism in your life, everything that weaves the fabric of how you navigate the difficulties of life being shattered, families torn apart, people are on the run. What organizations like International Medical Corps do, and other organizations, is we try to recreate coping mechanisms in these really fluid situations where people are being terrorized and killed every single day. We try to give them some sense of hope, some sense of support, some medical work, mental health work. The environment for child soldiers in these conflict areas is tremendous. And I want to say one other thing, and this goes back to a presentation that Arif and Fadi made yesterday that had a profound impact on me, and they are from the Dubai community and the region. They were talking about how every single day you and your businesses can invest in the communities that you work in, not to think of it as charity, but to think of it as an investment in the communities that build the resilience that is needed to fight things like human trafficking or child soldiers and the things that we live in every single day. I'm a member of the YPO committee, but I'm not a business person. But I will tell you, I think the business community punches below its weight. You have tremendous influence in the communities you are working in, and your influence and your power and your care for the world can have more impact than almost anything that anyone else can do. Organizations, you know, we will do the best that we can to create a safe environment and a protective environment for children who are fleeing for their lives. You know, there are 10,000 missing Syrian children right now.
14,000.
Well, and the numbers are changing. But the fact is, for all the things that are going on, every single day in your life, there's something that you can do about it in your own businesses, and when you think about the world and how you're connected to the world and the world that your children are growing up to take over and live in one day. So I just want to leave you with that note. It's hard to bring home the magnitude of this suffering, even when we see the images every day, but we absolutely have to face it and recognize that we're part of a community and that all the people in our community matters, and that what is happening in Syria or in conflict areas around the world impact directly on our lives and on lives of our future children and beyond that.
And let me leave you with a final note here. And here's a quote for you to ponder and to think about. The noblest charity is preventing the need for charity. And that's where the business community comes in. To have a conversation among your board members, your investors, because if you can do something that eliminates the increase in human trafficking or the increase in human suffering. Because this planet is in a very sick place, and it's only getting worse. But if you can have an impact, and a bigger impact than a politician, my vote is go for it, because it's not working with the politicians right now. Thank you, and God bless you.